have not. Yes, thank you. I have not been posting the recordings because the recordings on YouTube are just not being watched. When last there was one a year ago that was watched quite a bit, but our meetings since the close of the class have not been. I think they've been watched 5 or 6 times. But if any of you want them, I'll happily. Well, let's hear a vote. Do you think they're worth putting up on YouTube?
I think so.
Yeah, I
I
mean, I do
too.
rewatch them. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll put up there 2 that have not yet gone up, and this will be the 3rd. So I'll make sure all 3 go up.
Cool.
Yeah. Because like they're originally the only reason that I knew that these meetings were happening was because I started watching the videos from last year.
Okay. Okay. Will do. So Sasha, please to continue.
Yes. Okay. So Chris Conley, Mark Lauracini, and I made a game this year for the 2021 Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam. It's called Common Moonlight, and it's an encounter-based story world. It's about a funeral. So the theme, the idea of the game jam is they give you a theme and you have to make a game based around that theme in some way in less than 48 hours. But you can make general purpose code prior to the jam. So, but the things that are specific to that game have to be made within the 48 hours. So, a very short period of time to make a game, but the theme this year was joined together, and we interpreted the theme as there's a group of people who are joined together by their common connection to a particular character. So there's a character named Finley, who's an elderly man who dies in the first encounter, and there's a few characters who go to a funeral for Finley, and the characters don't really know each other very well prior to the funeral, but the funeral kind of brings them together. And so the idea is the player goes to this funeral and learns about this character that they knew a little bit about, or their character knew a little bit about, but they learn more about them. They learn, different perspectives on Finley from the people who knew Finley, if that makes sense. And let's see, pros and cons. So positives, we got a good number of encounters written for the time constraints. I think the writing is pretty good. Again, for the time constraints, it's engaging. We got comments on itch.io saying people were impressed. I got some comments from friends I shared it with saying they were really impressed. They thought it was excellent. I noticed that my friends perceived it as more complex than it really ended up being. So one of the consequences of the time constraint was we didn't really get much of the scripting done. We did the writing, and then we kind of made the encounters go in a more or less linear sequence. So you have 3 different characters and you speak to those characters, and then the game just sort of ends without any kind of conclusion to the story. And I think that our conclusion was that we needed more time to make any kind of game this way. I mean, we had 3 different writers. Each of us took a different character to write, and we still didn't finish.
You mean I've been working on Le Morte d'Arthur for 2 years and you couldn't finish yours in 2 days?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm still satisfied with, like, I'm glad we did it. I'm really happy with what we were able to accomplish. It was a lot of fun. And like I said, I think the writing is certainly enjoyable. Um, but I think that we failed to really script the characters in an interesting way. They, at least in the case of the character that I wrote, I basically wrote the encounters and the options that the player can pick and some of the reactions, but I wasn't able to script different reactions for the character to choose under different circumstances. Our idea was that at the end of the game, we were going to have speeches given by the different characters to kind of conclude the story. And the idea was that the characters were supposed to give different speeches based on your interactions with them. So if you if you anger the character, then they may refuse to give a speech and they may just storm out of the funeral. If you encourage the character, or you make them feel more comfortable, or help them cope with their loss, then they might give a different kind of speech. We weren't able to put that into the game, but I think that ultimately it was a good idea. We just didn't quite have the time to implement it. So um, I think artists are rarely satisfied with their art. So it's I kind of knew we probably weren't going to finish the game because I participated in the game jam last year and I wasn't able to finish my game there either. So I wasn't super surprised, but I'm still glad that we did it. And I think the writing is good. It's just that you need more time to actually script it. But I think that the system works, and I do think that with more time, we could have made a complete and engaging story world. I think that we showed that the system has the potential that we were trying to make it have, if that makes sense.
Chris, what were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I guess I felt the same way. I usually when I'm writing for this kind of interactive story, I script in pseudocode as I'm writing, and so my encounters had more scripting and reactions, but I ended up with less of them. So there's definitely kind of a trade-off in doing that. But yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with Sasha's conclusions there.
Okay, I've got some questions here. First, the observation that you have confirmed my own experience that you always underestimate how much work it takes to get a story world working. That's been the story of my life. But let me ask you, you started off specifying a very small story world. How long do you think it would have taken you to have finished what you set out to do without starting to add improvements?
I'd say probably a week would be a good target for a tiny story world like this.
Yeah, I think that we could have maybe a week or 2 weeks, give or take. We could have finished this particular story world. We did intend this was to the credit of Mark and Chris more than me. I had some other idea that I was starting off with that was going to be bigger, and because I always go big, but they kind of reeled me in a little bit, to their credit. And they said, okay, we need to make something that is as small as we can manage here. And I think we had a good number of encounters. It was just I think Chris had about 5 or 6 encounters, and Mark had 6 or 7 encounters, and I think I had 10. And I think overall that was a good number of encounters. Like I said, we could have used some encounters at the end to kind of conclude things. So we need a little bit more, but with 2 weeks, I think we could have finished the encounters and the scripting and the reactions and everything. It would be the longer, like the shorter the amount of time, the less sleep you're gonna get is the thing. Like it's not simply a matter of like if you have more time, you're going to use your time differently, if that makes sense. But I think probably a couple of weeks we could have completed a very tiny story world like this one.
Okay. So you appear to have built roughly 24 encounters. There's an interesting comparison with Lemort d'Arthur. 2 years work, I've got about 260 encounters. So I'm working a lot slower than you are, although my encounters, I mean, there's a lot of text here. I've got the total amount of text is about 600,000 characters, which is something like 100,000 words, which is
Okay.
the size of a big novel. And it's still growing. However, I also had to do a lot of research about ancient Britain and so forth. So it's interesting. And in fact, my own experience with story worlds is that the amount of labor increases not exponentially as a function of the size of the story world, but certainly more than linearly. Each additional encounter, you have to take into account more of the other encounters. So the complexity grows as the story world grows. You guys used your encounter editor, did you not, Sasha?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you feel satisfied with it? I mean, was the feature set adequate? Now, you're always going to want to say, "Oh, if I add this feature, it'll be even better." But for the limited design you had, was it adequate?
I would say with yes and no. So during the course of the game jam, I added a feature where you can actually add prerequisites to options rather than just encounters. So if an encounter shows up, then if the option doesn't have all of its prerequisites met, that single option is rendered invisible, but the others are still visible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
I added that feature during the 48 hours, and I ended up not having time to actually use it. So I probably should have just stuck with the feature set that I had at the start of the 48 hours and kept writing instead. But given the feature set that it has now, adding in the whole thing with option prerequisites, I think that the design we had, we could have implemented given the features that we had.
Yeah.
And it would have been up to the standards that we had set for ourselves.
Do you feel that there were features that were of little value? What do you think you could have stripped out and still had a good story world?
That's a really good question. I can't think of any, to be honest.
Okay.
Maybe Chris can think of some.
No, I feel like there's not too many features, I don't think. There's just maybe like one or two that would be nice to have.
Okay.
I guess we didn't really need, um, like my editor has a graph view
Yeah.
that lets you kind of see how the consequences go from one encounter to the next. I didn't really use that. Um, so there's certain things like that that are just on the editor side, but in terms of the processing by the story world itself, all the stuff under the hood in terms of how the story world worked and how the characters work, all that stuff I think is pretty crucial. It's just that I had some stuff kind of in terms of the graphical user interface of how my editor works that probably wasn't strictly necessary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think I ever used any of that far right pane, the
Okay.
statistics in the graph view.
That's interesting because it parallels my own experience with SWAT. I had built this lovely little feature that showed you a graphical representation of how various options spread out from a single verb. And it even showed weightings based on probabilistic analysis and so forth. Brilliant feature, never used it.
Okay.
It just wasn't that useful in the long run. So,
Gotcha. Okay.
so we do seem to be confirming each other's experiences.
Yeah.
One other question here.
Mhm.
What was the distribution of your hours in various types of labor? There was writing text, then doing the various scripting elements, and then there's finally, at the highest level, there's just figuring out the various connections you want. Between those three classes of work, how were your hours distributed?
We spent a good number of hours at the beginning coming up with the idea, which is a crucial part of the whole design. Um, so they gave us the theme. They released a video saying, "Here's the theme," and then we spent probably 7 hours before we actually came up with the idea of the funeral and having just three specific characters that you'd interact with. And so there's maybe 7 hours for that. And then after that, I think there were a couple of bugs I fixed and certain things we did, but I think it depended on which author. So in my case, I spent most of my time just writing. I wrote the dialogue. It was almost entirely dialogue for the characters, and I did almost no scripting for any of my encounters, which I think I just needed more time to do the scripting. But in my case, I did almost no scripting, and almost all of it was just writing the dialogue and a bit of prose and things like that. I think in Chris's case, it was a bit more even. He wrote fewer encounters, but he did actually scripted them. And then in Mark's case, it was maybe somewhere in between Chris and I. So um, we had very different distributions there in terms of what we spent our time on. I also spent 2 or 3 hours implementing the feature I mentioned where you can have prerequisites just for specific options. And I spent maybe half an hour making an image as cover art for our game, which is just a chessboard with a moon. That didn't take too long, but I put that together because I wanted us to have cover art because I think that I was thinking that would increase the number of people who saw our game because last year I didn't have cover art for my game, and I think that placed me at a disadvantage. So, and there was also testing. So I, before the game was uploaded to itch.io, I contacted some friends of mine and asked them to test it. And so there was a little bit of time spent just getting in touch with people who could test the game and kind of coordinating and things like that. So overall, I think the bulk of my time was spent just writing the dialogue, but there was a lot of other stuff besides dialogue and scripting that went into creating the game, like testing and coordinating and just coming up with the ideas in the first place and stuff like that.
Arnold, Ajmal, do either of you have any questions?
No, not really, but I do enjoy listening about the game.
Cool.
I had a quick look at the game. It looks interesting. No questions right now, though.
Okay. Well, then, would you two like to, Sasha and Chris, would you like to give any final comments on it before we move on to Ajmal's question?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that I'm proud of us. I'm really happy that Chris and Mark were able to do this with me. I'm really happy with what we put together. I understand we didn't quite finish it and didn't quite get exactly how we envisioned it, but overall, I'm extraordinarily glad with what we accomplished.
Chris?
Yeah, I guess I feel the same way. And yeah, I think that a game jam is a good way to test a editor like this to see whether the system works and you're able to use it to make a finished project, or at least something that you can run through beginning to end, and it's just a good stress test of the whole system.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. Ajmal has a very interesting question here. I'd like to clarify some aspects of it, though. First, by storylets, do you mean what we've been calling encounters?
Yeah, I guess it'd be encounters, but also like if you look at Facade, they've kind of broken everything up into chunks of stories.
Beats, yeah.
And I guess you can also use parametric storylets, where each storylet doesn't necessarily have all the details, but the drama generator picks a storylet based on the state of the story world, and it picks which characters would fit that storylet best at that specific moment.
Okay, and then for what you call a purely simulationist approach, do you think that my SWOT design is, what we had in the Storytron technology is close to what you're talking about?
I would say so, yeah. I see a simulationist approach as something like The Sims or Storytron, where each agent makes a decision based on the state of the story world, and there's no overarching drama generator or drama engine that drives things forward, I guess.
Okay, okay. Well, let's see. Oh, and could you expand on your phrase, the oatmeal problem?
Yeah, I think, let me just look it up. Yeah, I think Kate Compton called it the oatmeal problem. Basically that it's very easy to pour 10,000 bowls of plain oatmeal, with each oat being in a different position and each bowl being essentially unique, but it's very hard to make these differences matter to an audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of the problem with the simulationist approach as I see it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, might be like the Tinker Toy text problem where the generated story ends up seeming robotic if you're not spending a whole lot of time making a lot of variations.
Let's see, do you see? Okay, first, I agree with you that the simulation approach in Storytron theoretically offers richer interactivity. That is, just looking at the two technologies, an encounter-based system or a Storytron-based system or something like those, I think it is easy to determine that the simulationist approach is going to have greater capacity for dramatic developments. But my experience has been that actually realizing that capacity is extremely difficult. Yeah, I suppose that if you had a big team, you know, and you had a few $1 million to throw at it, you probably could build something adequate. But boy, oh dear. Is my sound much better now? Oh, okay, good. I'm not sure which microphone it was using. I have a special microphone I use for recording video. Let's see. However, with an encounter-based system, has the potential to get into greater diversity of behavior. That is, a simulationist approach is going to have a defined set of verbs, and those are the only things that can happen. And so they're going to tend to be rather generalized verbs, whereas an encounter-based system could have a situation where you have to stick the babblefish in your ear in order to translate. It can bring up all sorts of weird developments. So I'm uncertain though as to, I don't think I can draw a general conclusion.
You don't think one is inherently better than the other? You think both approaches are valid?
Yeah, I think I can say that it's likely that if you throw a big team of people at it, then the simulation approach will produce better results. One thing I've been toying with of late is the notion of just starting off with a big generalized verb set. That is, with Storytron, basically you added a verb every time you saw a dramatic need, and you'd end up adding, I ended up with maybe 100 verbs for C-Boot, and that just wasn't enough. It just produced a fairly dull experience. An idea that occurred recently to me, and I'm going to devote a little time to explaining this, is that, I'm sorry. It occurred to me that there is sort of a standard set of verbs. This is Carlton, your doorman. Standard set of verbs, sort of fundamental verbs that are most commonly used. And there's a good place to find them. I actually have 4 books on this, but here's one of them. A dictionary of selected synonyms in the principal Indo-European languages. These are sort of standard words that keep showing up over and over in different languages. For example, 1057, enter. Just the notion of going into a place. 1061, carry, as in the sense of bearing something. These are all sort of basic. Here's arrive, overtake, approach, pursue. These are sort of fundamental concepts in Indo-European. I have 3 other books about Indo-European words that are common. And it's interesting, there's a lot of difference between them, but there's also a goodly amount of overlap. And this suggests to me that perhaps the way to do it is to start off with a general set, that is, define, say, 1,000 fundamental verbs. By the way, another place to find them. Maybe the way to do this is to put together 4 or 5 lists and then extract the most common elements. But another way is a thesaurus, which lists something like 1,000 fundamental concepts. And so you could have incombustibility. I'm not sure what the verb for that. That would be a word though. Publication, information. Anyway, so the idea would be first compile a bunch of lists of fundamental concepts, then, cross check them all and boil it down to one list of 1,000 fundamental concepts. Then make words out of those, and then build a story world utilizing those words. But there's a killer problem with that, and that is the language used. See, the obvious thing is to use, English. You can't ask people to learn a completely new language with a vocabulary of 1,000 weirdo words. And so you'd have to use English, but that raises a new problem of connotation. That is, English words will have narrow connotations that can be confusing, or they'll have multiple synonyms. The classic example here is the verb get, which has hundreds of different meanings. And so if you use that verb, it's likely that people will not understand it. Now, contextual factors might solve the problem. It's hard to say. So I don't know, that's a thought. I think that kind of thing is necessary for a simulationist approach. That is, the simulationist is closely tied to the issue of language. It's hard to do a simulation without having some kind of general purpose language for people to use. And perhaps, in fact, the long-term solution, I think, will be something between Siri and Star Trek. That is, in Star Trek, they just speak normal, everyday English to the computer and it understands. Siri has a much more limited vocabulary, but it works also. It's just that an awful lot of the time, Siri ends up saying, well, I found this on the web, and that's inadequate for our purposes. So can we get a super version of Siri? It will still have to have a constrained vocabulary. We're never going to be able to get general purpose language running on a computer. There are just too many weirdo contextual issues with general purpose language. But we can probably get something good enough for dramatic purposes. Comments?
I guess your description of needing 1,000 general purpose verbs, it's interesting because that's kind of the approach of most of the interactive fiction authoring systems. They set up a basic world model with things and people and locations, And they also define at least several dozen, if not a couple hundred, basic general purpose verbs. And generally, they also allow authors to specify new ones. But usually, these basic verbs are enough to let people write typical, simple sorts of interactive fiction right out of the box.
I wonder, do you think, see, the problem I have seen in interactive fiction is that few of the verbs are really about emotions or drama.
Yep.
And so question is, do you think, or how feasible would it be to simply take standard interactive fiction technology and just stuff verbs in that handle emotional interaction?
I mean, I think you can, like certain of Emily Short's works have been very character and dialogue heavy, but basically you would need to define a whole, probably couple hundred sets of dialogue and character interacting verbs specifically to make that possible.
The problem that bothers me about any use of language is, I don't know how to characterize it. I can just give a few examples. For example, the example I use over and over and over again is Star Wars #2. No, I am your father. You know, one of the major dramatic points in that movie. And yet, how does declaring a familial relationship comprise a major dramatic moment? I mean, if somebody else said to Leia, well, not Leia, to Han Solo, oh, I am your father, that would have zero dramatic significance. So, in fact, in the vast majority of cases, the statement, I am your father, has no dramatic significance whatsoever. And yet, in this case, because of the context, this one statement had enormous dramatic significance. We see this type of thing over and over again, where where some small fact that in most circumstances would be meaningless has great significance. I'll give you another example. Kathy and I have been going through Deep Space Nine, watching the whole series on Netflix. By the way, I continue to be in Deep Space Nine has a lot more drama in it than any other Star Trek series. That is, I mean, there are very few people, there are very few phaser shots, very few explosions, not that much weirdo stuff happening with odd scientific phenomena and so forth. It's a great deal of human drama with alien species. But there was one where one of the characters said to another character, you know, I thought that device that lady had might be an interesting thing to sell. So I took it apart, and what I discovered was in the functional portion of it, there wasn't anything. It doesn't do anything. That had enormous significance because, well, I won't explain why, but that one fact just turned the whole story upside down. And so again, the fact that a device had no functioning parts, you know, again, we see this over and over, that small things that you normally wouldn't mention can have enormous dramatic significance. How do you handle that? It's pretty easy in an encounter-based system, but in a simulationist.
I think that's just a case where to handle those special cases, you just have to write them, just hand author them. Like you start with a base of general purpose verbs to handle the everyday situations. And then the stuff that really changes things on their head in any given story, you have to special case it.
Okay, what about the solution that I started with C-Boot and then basically got so demoralized I gave up on it? What about integrating encounter-based systems with simulation systems? That is, the bulk of the interaction goes through the standard simulation, but for those special cases, you insert encounters. That sounds like an entirely too glib a solution. Well, yeah, best of both worlds and all of that. And so I'm a little skeptical of it, but what do you guys think?
I think maybe this is one of those cases where you need an inference engine, and I know you've written about them in the past, but I don't know, I think a lot of the most dramatic verbs and events in a story world actually aren't made explicit, but they're inferred. Like, for example, no one would say, I'm lying to you about this, but they might say something and you might realize that that's false. And so you just have to infer that from an inference engine, I guess. Do you think that's worth looking into?
Boy, an inference engine, what you're talking about really is a general purpose inference engine. And that sort of brings in, well, let's have an object called reality and break it down into classes. So, you know, planets, stars, machines, animals, and so forth. And that's just too big. An inference engine works well on a defined set, a defined subset of reality. But for drama,
I mean, couldn't you train the database of the inference engine on the story world that you've made and the verbs that you've created specifically? I don't have that much experience with them, but
that might work. I don't know. I've looked hard at the problem, at the possibility of just starting with a standard neural network system and feeding lots of stories into it. We have gigantic databases of scripts. For example, take scripts from detective shows. We have 50 years worth of detective shows and, you know, many tens of thousands of scripts. We've got the database, but could we actually utilize it? I'm dubious because all too often these detective stories will have some little twist that is implicit to the audience, but not implicit to the AI system. That is, the key factor that opens it up is some odd little thing. A good example, the TV series CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, where they end up discovering that you know, they found a trace of powder, and the powder, when chemically analyzed, turns out to have this element in it, which could only have been associated with this particular location, which means it had to be this guy. Boy, how do you get an AI system? I mean, it only that's just one case. Does the AI system recognize that one case? It's not going to be used again in any other murder mystery. You know, I don't know.
So I've noticed I've been watching a children's cartoon recently called Code Lyoko, and I've noticed I shouldn't be surprised, but they repeat animations all the time in Code Lyoko, and it works in that show. It's noticeable, especially watching it as an adult, but it works because they make the animations kind of iconic, and you know they have a different context for it. But you know they'll have different episodes where they'll repeat certain beats of a fight scene, or they'll repeat different actions, And I was thinking in terms of computer game design, it kind of made me feel less upset with the limitations of game design because you have repetition quite a bit in computer games as well. But apparently it's not just computer games that do that. You have that same kind of repetition in a lot of TV shows where the same actions will be repeated in different episodes. The same, not just the same verbs, but similar situations. And I think when people play games, and I think this would be the case in story worlds as well, I think people will accept some level of repetition there. Y- People understand the limitations of the games they're playing, and so people will accept that yes, you know, they don't have a different twist for every single playthrough in the game, but the characters are engaging and worth interacting with, and the situations are interesting, and so you can have a lot of elements that are repeated, and people will be fine with it because it just won't bother them because that's a part of the limitation of art, especially right now.
You just, I just had a realization based on something you said that might have profound significance, and that concern. Let's talk about the verbs in a typical shooter. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Shoot, run, jump, duck, go backwards, not that many verbs. But those verbs have lots of very fine adverbial modifiers. That is, on shooting, it depends critically on exactly when you shoot, exactly where you are. If you're just 2 steps off, you miss. Exactly where you're aiming, which means you gotta, hand-eye coordination has to be just right. You put those things together, and each event, each action taken by the player is actually quite complex.
Yes.
Shoot with this modifier, that modifier, that modifier, that one, and so forth. Whereas with the Storytron system, you had very few modifiers. In the same way, sports. People love to watch, sports games, and in effect, they do tell stories. And yet you think, what is there to baseball? Pitcher throws the ball, batter swings, batter hits or misses. There's just not that much going on. But in fact, the precise way that the pitcher throws the ball or the precise way that the batter swings the bat makes all the difference in the world. So there's enormous adverbial modification of the verbs in these. So few verbs, lots of modifiers. Can that concept be applied to interactive storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, like the analogy I've usually thought of as far as interactive storytelling is that I guess like the same that it's like in terms of human interaction and dialogue of basically the equivalent of like combat in a tactical fighting game, like a tactical RPG or something, where even from the same initial situation with characters on one side against the other, and they have certain health and armor and weapons and things, items that they're carrying, that it can go off in a million different directions from that initial position. And even if they're only using a few different verbs, because the situation is different every point along the way, it can end up in very different places at the end of each combat. And generalizing that out to like conversations.
I agree with both of you. I think that the context matters immensely. The context maybe matters almost more than the verbs themselves. I mean, obviously we need the verbs to have to do with drama, but a completely different context can change the meaning of those verbs for the characters and for the player.
Okay, let me just throw this thought into it. Here are a number of expressions of exactly the same statement. That is, same verb, different adverbial modifiers. You are so beautiful. You are so beautiful. You're so beautiful. You're just so beautiful. You're so beautiful. Those adverbial modifiers give completely different meanings to that one verb. But
Yes.
how could we build that into a simulation system?
Well, there's multiple ways to do it. The simplest way to do it is to have really good writing, which is not a trivial task. But if you have a novel, a good novelist can write a scene in such a way that the context is given by very subtle details. You could have something as simple as suppose you have a character that early on in the story is adamantly opposed to smoking, and then in a later scene you have just a single line, just a few words saying they have a cigarette, right? So you, in a single sentence, you can describe this whole arc for this character and imply this immense amount of change that has taken place, right? That's just one example, but a good writer, I think, can take those kinds of verbs and sentences and so forth, and can craft a scene in such a way that all that subtlety and meaning is there in the writing itself and can come across to the player.
But that sounds appropriate to an encounter-based system, not a simulation system.
True, but I am thinking that the best way to do things is to combine the two, as I think you were getting at earlier. The way you did in your early Sabut game, if you have a simulation that is tracking character relations under the hood and tracking different things, and then you trigger encounters based on the context. The computer is able to say, okay, here's this context. We have a love triangle going on between these characters, and that triggers this specific encounter. Or you have, you can come up with the dramatic situations from Pulte, for example. You can use those as kind of a starting point, for instance. But you have different contexts, and the computer can say, okay, in this context, all the variables are set up this way based on what's happened before, so we'll trigger a particular encounter. And yeah, I am thinking that the best way to do it is to combine them. I do think that you need good writing. Maybe in the future we'll have some kind of animation system where you can have a more purely simulation-based approach, and you can use facial animations and body posture and things like that. Even like choice of outfit can characterize a character quite a bit. But different things like that could help in the future. But right now, I think that we need to use the strength of our writing to carry the game, and I think that an encounter-based system is a better way for us to do that.
I guess one idea that I had back when we were making Cebu, but we didn't go with that, was instead of adding adverbs to verbs, which tend to get clunky in a text-based input system, to instead pick from one of a set of emoticons, face images for each verb, and that would modify the emotional valence and affect how people respond to you. You could greet someone happily or angrily or bored or annoyed.
Yeah.
And it would be the same verb, but with a different semantic meaning.
Well, there is the problem I saw with the emoticon approach was that there were so many. You know, you'd end up with this huge menu, and it was tiresome.
Well, I would limit it to at most 5 or maybe 6 at max for each verb, and some would maybe only have 2 or 3 or 4. It would be set per verb.
Yeah, that's a good point. You could do it that way. Okay. Well, we're out of time here, but I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to, you know, raise any final points if you'd like. Does anybody have any final comments before we shut down?
I think we're making
Just-
progress.
Yeah, we got a lot of good ideas this time. So,
I guess, how is Le Mort d'Arthur looking? Do you still have a lot of encounters that don't have reactions or options written for them?
all I have done right now is concentrate on the set of encounters themselves. In fact, if you look at that file I uploaded, diplomacy.png, it shows a tiny section dealing with one basic interaction. I've written dozens of these little things, and it can take me a good hour or two just to sort out exactly which things belong there. And in fact, that one I ended up reversing. And anyway, so I've been organizing the encounters, writing the encounter text, and that's about all. I've done a little bit of scripting, but I haven't even begun on scripting, and I do not intend to. I am convinced that the right way to do this is to first develop the overall structure with lots of little diagrams like that one, and then to write in all the text for it, along with the options, and then to start filling in options and scripts and reactions. So that's, I think that's the way it'll go. I am hoping that I will finish this first stage by September 1st. And then I can get to work on scripting, which I actually don't think will take terribly long. So I'm feeling kind of good that that I might have it done by the end of the year. However, that's only the core of the design. There's still a lot of other issues, such as facial displays, or in fact, in the current presentation, every encounter has an image that goes with it. In some of these, the image is the face of the other character. Others, though, are more contextual in nature. You know, there's some that show the Camelot, what it looks like. There's another that shows the stockade, the front gate of the stockade there. Lots of these, there's one with a horse and so forth. So this will happen only if I end up with the money to hire artists to do that. Fortunately, there is a fellow who is possibly going to fund that. So maybe I can put something up on Patreon. We'll just have to see.
Sounds great.
And I will give a report when I do, when I've reached a major milestone. So.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and I'll see you next month. If you have a suggestion for a topic to discuss, by all means, email me with it, and I can put it into the otherwise empty agenda.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, okay, bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.